So with the housekeeping done on the live edge slab, I could then mill up plenty of 8/4 walnut and start gluing up the blanks for my legs with plenty of squeeze out. Once those were dry, I could take off all the clamps and mill those flat and then start laying out for my legs using the template I made. As you can see, I mirrored it side to side to maximize my material. Then using the track saw, I'll rip those right down the middle, cut those to length at a 2.5 degree miter over at the miter saw. And then I could make this little template. So I tack on these little blocks that make perfect alignment top and left. And then I can draw my final layout lines, and then over at the joiner, pass after pass until I get down to that layout line gives me 4 perfect legs. Then I could lay out for the giant bridle joint. As you can see there, I cleaned it up on the table saw and then over to the bench with a chisel. Before I cut the mating piece, I cut a test piece on the table saw to make sure it's a nice fit. And then it's back to the table saw to make this giant, what is really a tenon, but it's a bridle joint. And then I cut a little angle on it just for a nice detail. And then as you can see, this is how the table legs will lay out with the stretchers. Using a router plane, I clean up and make that face nice and flat. And then I have to rabbet out the bottom. Then I could put it on the bench and do a dry fit. Slide those legs in, and that's nice. But now I have a bottom stretcher that I need to figure out, so I cut that to length. Make sure that fits nicely, and I'm going to space it about 1 inch from the top and then mark out for my dominoes. Plunge for those dominoes, top and bottom, so I got a 2 stack or a 4 stack really. And that's a nice tight fit. And then before the glue up, I want to make sure I sand everything nice and flat. And then I could start slinging some glue and inserting some dominoes. Make sure I clean up any squeeze out in there. Clamp those tight. Now I'm using hide glue on this, which doesn't introduce a lot of moisture. That way it makes the joint a little bit easier to assemble. Clamp those up, and then the next day, pull those out of the clamp, and using a card scraper and a chisel, I remove any excess squeeze out. I don't want any of that interfering with the finish. And then some final hand sanding, and then I could lay these legs on the live edge slab. Now it was time for some big old mortise and tenon joints. So I laid out for my mortise, and then cleaned out the majority of the material at the drill press, and then squared off all those walls with a chisel using a guide block to keep me nice and vertical and square. And then I just cleaned out the corners with a mortising chisel as well, and use a router plane to clean up my tenon, and that is a nice tight fit. Then back at the table saw, I could rip down some pieces for my stretchers, which in this case, 19.5 degrees to meet that bottom stretcher of the leg. Laid out for my dominoes, plunged 4 of them, and insert those nice and tight. And then I used a shop-made guide block with layout lines to make sure I had equal spacing on all of my dominoes on my little web frame for underneath the table. Glued those together. Oh, put those in the wrong spot, and plane those flush, sand them, and then I'll put them in again. Now let's see how this thing fits. That's a little better. Now everything's lined up. Glue is in. I'm using epoxy on these because I need a little more open time, and I taped off those for any squeeze out. Clamped those together. When those were dry, oh yeah, look at that big old table base. And some more glue squeeze out. Use a chisel and a card scraper. Real fun stuff. And then some compressed air to get any other residue out of there. And wipe clean with some mineral spirits. And these are table buttons. These will be used to attach the top to the base. But first, let's route out some recesses underneath the table that will accept some steel C-channel. This will keep the tabletop flat since it's going at the beach that's going to see a lot of temperature changes with moisture and such. I want to make sure this thing stays nice and flat, so this steel channel with slotted holes allow for wood movement. And then it was time to apply the finish. I'm using Rubio Monocoat hard wax oil on this one, so I spread it on and then wipe off all the excess, dry to the touch. And before I put finish on the top, I needed to steam out a few dents. So with a wet rag and a little hot iron, I steamed that out nice and flush, applied my hard wax oil, did final assembly, and here are some beauty shots. Really loving the look of this walnut grain with the hard wax oil and that big beefy base. Simple yet modern looking. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you on the next one.